In this video, I want to look at the planes of motion and how they relate to exercise. And keep in mind that when we look at the cardinal planes, we're looking at the joint actions, but we do look at the external environment and see how the projectile or implement or weight that we're moving is moving within those planes. So you have your three cardinal planes, you have your frontal plane, your sagittal plane, and transverse plane. And these come together to make that three-dimensional or three-coordinate system that we look at with the 3 degrees of freedom, each degree representing one of the cardinal planes. Your grip, position, hand width, whether it's wide or narrow, will force you, based on anatomy and function, into particular planes. So the wider you go, like in pressing, you're going to go more in the transverse plane. In pulling activities, you're going to go more in the frontal plane, and the narrower grip you're going to do is going to force you into the sagittal plane. So you can kind of see here in this image that when you take a wider grip, you're going to have more space here between the arm and the torso, and that's going to force you, if you were looking down, into that transverse plane. And when you're narrow, the bar is going to travel further down, your arm's going to be tighter to the side here, and it's going to force you more in the sagittal plane. You can kind of see that represented here in terms of if the arm is moving here, it's going to be more flexion and extension, whereas here in this type with the wider grip, it's going to be more horizontal ab and abduction. So if we look at, let's say, an overhead press, we look at a vertical pushing movement, this is going to be with a wider grip, predominantly the frontal plane. You can see here that as the arms move up and down, you're doing this ab and abduction, or more technically horizontal abduction as you're doing this. If I go narrower with my grip, or I have dumbbells and I stay within that force of that sagittal plane, you can see that as the arms move up and down, that's more flexion and extension, and that's movement that's occurring through the sagittal plane. Same thing happens with bench press. Remember, the coordinate system moves with you, so as the person lays down, so does that plane come with them. So with a wide grip bench press, you're going to be more into that transverse or coronal plane. I'm sorry, transverse or horizontal plane. So if I take a narrow grip or keep my hands closer together, this exercise, even though he's supine on his back, that's going to be more sagittal plane activity. And you can see that the arms are going more through flexion and extension, versus in the next slide I show you here the transverse plane. Because of the wider grip or the wider movement, arms are moving further apart. I'm doing more horizontal adduction, abduction here, and this is going to be transverse plane activity. Carries on through lower body. If I do a deadlift and I have a narrower stance, predominantly sagittal plane is going to be the movement here that this exercise is occurring in. I can alternate this and go wider with my stance. So here you can see your narrow stance squat, and you can over here see the opposite of that, like a plie or a wide stance squat, sumo squat. And you can see that this is more sagittal plane dominant, and this is more frontal plane dominant. Now, when we typically squat or press, we're going to pick something in the oblique or the diagonal plane. So this is that fourth plane, that is any plane that's not one of those three cardinal. And you can see that most time when you squat, if you were to look at from a bird's eye view straight down, your feet would form like a V shape with your toes. So the heels would be in more and the toes would be flared out. And depending upon how wide you are, your feet are going to flare more. So if I'm in a more narrow stance, my feet are going to be parallel to each other. And so I'll be predominantly in the sagittal plane. If I go wider with my stance, my toes are going to flare out more, and I'm going to favor more the frontal plane. But realistically, most of the time, if someone takes a comfortable shoulder width grip or shoulder width stance, they're not going to be in the sagittal plane or the frontal plane or transverse plane. They're going to be in that diagonal plane, somewhere in between. Same application applies to pulling exercises. On the left, you see a narrow grip start. On the right, you see a wide grip start. And if I do a narrow grip, this is going to force me into the sagittal plane. You can see here, as I pull down, that the shoulder is going to go through more flexion and extension. And if I represent these, the body segments as these lines, here's the torso, here's the upper arm, here's the forearm, you can see that I can see quite a bit of movement there. If I try to look at this from the back, it's going to be hard for me to see because I'm going to see more of a straight line, and I'm not going to be able to really appreciate that plane unless I move to the side here so I can see what's going on in that activity. Now the opposite is true for the wide grip. If I do a wide grip pull down, if I look at it from the side, it's going to be hard for me to see. But if I go from the back here, I'm going to be able to appreciate that plane of motion where that movement's occurring. So that narrow grip is going to be more sagittal plane, where the wide grip is going to force you more into that frontal plane. And if I try to look at the sagittal plane from the side here, I'm not going to be able to see much. I'm going to see like a straight line or distorted view. This applies even into the pulling exercises in the transverse plane. You can see that with the wider grip, it's forcing me more into this horizontal or transverse plane. And if I go narrower grip here, it's going to force me more into that sagittal plane, more flexion and extension versus more horizontal ab and abduction. So if I look at any exercise now, I should be able to visualize that a little narrower stance, this is mostly sagittal plane. If I look at here, pull downs, wider stance or wider grip, mostly frontal plane. And then if I go narrow, I'm going to be in the sagittal plane. So this just kind of shows how you can look at the three cardinal planes and then that fourth plane, which is that diagonal plane, some plane that does not exist in the frontal, sagittal, transverse, is kind of going at an angle. But we look at exercise and we try to analyze and we try to associate that with the most dominant plane that exercise is occurring in. And it helps you appreciate that your grip position matters. In terms of muscle recruitment, it's very similar, but in terms of biomechanics and the motor control, slightly different because of the plane dominance.